Now, as much as I've grown to love IT tech at large, there are a lot of acronyms and terms and things that just throw you completely off, especially if you're not like a prodigy or something that has been doing this stuff and tinkering with computers since you were like 5. So I had to play a lot of catch up before I was able to make the transition into IT ops. One of the terms that I kind of ended up figuring out, but it still kind of eluded me a little bit, was a term called configuration. And I know this seems kind of like random, but for tech people, more so IT people like network engineers, architects, and the like, this is actually pretty important because configuring certain devices is part of some people's day-to-day job. And even for those of us like me, where that's not part of my day-to-day job, I still kind of have to look at that because when I look at certain like logs from our customers who are trying to fix an issue, the device went off network, a bunch of other things happened, we still need to pay attention and do like log analysis, get logs from them, and pass them to our tech support center. Sometimes I take a look at the logs myself and try to figure out, well, how do you have this device configured? Because that might play a role in the situation that we're dealing with. And so we can, resolve this issue and close out the ticket. Otherwise, if it's not a configuration issue, it may be something else. Maybe it's something that you did. Maybe there's something wrong with some of the supplies that we sent you. It can be a few different things. But point of the matter is, let's figure out what configuration is, and let's see if God of War in particular can help us out. Really RPGs, but we're going to try to stick to God of War. So again, for primarily IT, when you're dealing with servers, you have the individual devices and computers themselves, tablets, laptops, workstations, hubs, routers, switches, all that stuff. All of these devices can be configured. Personally, I've always translated the term configured to setup. So when you're talking about how something is configured, how you configure something, you're saying how you set it up. That's how I personally translate it anyway. I'll even give you a better example. Something that can be configured that's pretty important is firewalls. I think everyone has a basic idea of what firewalls are used for. So when it comes to firewalls, the way you configure it, especially when you're dealing with corporate stuff, is pretty important. Because the whole point of firewalls is to block out people from getting into your network and getting into your devices so that they can't see certain information. Like, there's no reason, like if you were a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, Fortune 100 company, that type of thing, and someone that's not an employee or like maybe an investor or something of your organization, there's no reason for them to see some of your corporate information. They can steal your stuff. They may harm yourself, your employees, some other investors and partners, stakeholders, all that stuff. They can do a lot of damage. So if you don't need to see certain things, we're not going to let you in to see it. And the whole point of firewalls is to help make that real. The problem is if you, as an example, try to configure a firewall and you did it wrong, and you basically allow in all traffic, like someone types in, like whatever the name of your company is, www.companyaa.com, and they're not an employee, they're not an investor, none of that. They have no direct connection to your company that you own, run, and operate and are making good money off of, right? But any person in the world types in the URL and can instantly get into like your actual internal company, corporate like website and all the other stuff and see corporate information. Yeah, you didn't do that right. There's layers to this, but that's just one example to say like, okay, firewalls, they can block traffic based on location. So let's say if you're here in America and you're based in America, you have no employees based outside the country. So if a Canadian tries to get into your corporate network, your firewall should automatically black them out because if you base it on location, they're not going to be able to get in since they're not in American territory. And even then, there's going to be other ways for them to like prove they are who they say they are and therefore can access the information from there. Same thing like if someone tried to access it from Jamaica, from the UK, and you have no employees over there, yeah, you can set up a firewall to discriminate based on location. But the more typical way is to filter by IP address. And that's just a whole other thing in itself. That's better to show you than to just talk about it because it can get a little confusing if you don't know what this stuff looks like. But my point being, that's just one example of a very important like device or component that companies and people in general use to make sure that people don't get into their computers and see stuff that they're not supposed to see it because it has nothing to do with them. It's not their business base. So let's try to paint a better picture with this for the nerds that get it. We're going to try to use God of War with this one. So configuration, if you're familiar with RPGs in general, the new God of War games, the newer ones, not the original run, the newer ones, Elden Ring, Skyrim, Elder Scrolls, I heard is one, just any of the newer RPGs and just RPGs in general, where they have like stats and stuff. Configuration is a key part of those games because the way that you use like Kratos, like me, any game that I play, I'm very big on like physical attack. I'm a more offensive player. God of War, anything Dragon Ball related, Pokemon. That's why I like Pokemon. I'm not that good because I'm so big on attack. And when I don't play competitively. I very rarely in my life have ever played Pokemon like online. But people will be having Pokemon that I completely ignore, like say Chansey, for example. You know, like the pink kind of nurse looking Pokemon. And Chansey, I don't think is that physically strong, but goodness, if you give Chansey the right like light screen, reflect, some other stuff to put to buff up its physical defense and special defense, Chansey is a tank. It's a pain. Like you can use because prior to it becoming part fairy type, it was only normal type. So if you use fighting type moves on a normal type Pokemon, it's super effective. You can use like focus blast, focus punch, things like that. You can use fighting type moves on a buffed up Chansey, and it'll be super effective. And it'll only lose like this much health in the bar. It's a pain. And then on top of that, if it uses like spikes, poison spikes, or if it buffs up its physical attack or something else, it could be a pain. Sorry, I went completely off there, but like when it comes to RPGs in particular, God of War included, I'm very big on physical attack. The problem is when you look at configurations, for those who aren't familiar with RPGs, depending on the game, it can be a little bit different. The stats like attack, defense, maybe speed, vitality, magic in God of War, they call it runic. You know, it depends on the game. Some games have different stats that other games don't have. Some have more stats than others. It's a whole thing. But here's the thing. Each of those stats is influenced by like the armor and weapons and other skills that you assign to that character. So certain armor and weapons or handles and things that you use for Kratos will boost his attack, but maybe won't increase his runic, meaning his magic attacks, they're not going to do much damage. But his physical attacks, if you punching, kicking, using his blades, the Leviathan axe, all that stuff, it'll definitely do some damage. Now, another trade-off stereotypically is I'm gonna buff my attack. Cool. But let's say if I didn't use armor and things to buff up my defense as well, I just made myself a glass cannon. These all have to do with configurations, the way you set something up and design something. And with that said, the way you configure or set something up always has pros and cons. Like I said, I'm very big on offensive play. It's not that I don't do any defense at all. It's just not like my top priority. I can adapt depending on like the character. If it's Pokemon, then I can use a defensive Pokemon and do some damage later. You know what I'm saying? But I like attacking, right? So I usually use armor and other items that focus on getting my attack up as well as my health, my vitality. But as a result, maybe my defense stat is average. My runic, non-existent. My luck, definitely non-existent, right? But now let's say, there's someone that prefers to be defensive. So they won't be a glass cannon, they'll be a tank. They'll be able to take hits from even some of the tougher bosses and barely any damage will be done to them. But when they attack, it's probably going to take them a while, like a lot longer than it would for me to finally win that fight. But they won't die as much. They won't have to use maybe resurrection stones and things like that. It's a few different things. You may not be big on physical attack. You may be more of the magic type of person. So your runic, even though it's not like one of the main stats in God of War, but your runic may be maxed out or almost maxed out. So whenever you use certain runic abilities, poisons, and those type of things, or even with Freya, if you use some of her runic magic, it can either last longer, do more damage, or both, right? And that's good. But now your physical attack may not be up to snuff. You may have more vitality, meaning you have more health, but you don't have enough attack or defense for it to really matter in the long run. It's all a matter of give and take, pros and cons. If I do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen, right? That's configuration, the way you design it. Because I can have 2 copies of God of War, or I can play God of War and someone else can play God of War, and we're obviously dealing with the same characters, Kratos, Atreus, Freya. We're playing the same game, we're going down the same path, doing the same missions, all this stuff. But the way that they set up Kratos in terms of his items and things, his settings, can drastically change our experience with the game. Okay. So that's configuration, because you can have configuration when it comes to, let's say, servers, like physical servers for computers. You can have one configured a certain type of way, or even going back to firewalls, you can have 2 different firewalls that you use for different reasons. You have a network firewall. You have firewalls for each individual workstation or computer, including your mobile devices. There are firewalls for everything. Now, you may have a network firewall that's configured to not let people in if they're trying to contact or reach your company website and corporate files outside the country. But then there's another side to it. They're like, okay, now we need to only let in traffic with a certain IP address. That would be you. I think you can do that with the same firewall, but maybe for the sake of argument, let's just say there's a different firewall with that particular configuration. You have one firewall set up by location, you have another one set up by actual IP addresses, there may be another firewall host based for another reason. It's a bunch of different things. Same items, but they have different purposes. They are used for different reasons, right? And you determine the reason, or rather someone should be able to look and tell for what reason you set this up based on how you configured it, based on how you set it up. And again, this can apply to routers, servers, hubs, switches, bridges. Hubs, I don't think they're used anymore. It's not a good idea, but the list goes on and on, right? My point being, a lot of people tend to get caught up with this term. I had an old neighbor that asked me about this before. This was back before I even grew completely comfortable with the concept, but now I think I get it and I'm pretty comfortable with the concept now. So hopefully for those who were kind of having a hard time with that, especially with the migration to tech, big tech especially, hopefully this was helpful and cleared that up a bit, because it's one word, it's a simple concept, but it's one of those core concepts of tech, because even if you don't deal with this stuff directly, you're going to need to know what this stuff means, or it would be better for you to know what this means because it may impact your job in other ways, right? Or even if you do this stuff as a hobby, still, it may have an impact on your experience. So hopefully this was beneficial and it was helpful and I cleared that up for you. But I'm gonna go ahead and leave this video off at that. If you have any feedback or questions or anything like that for me, share that with me in the comment section below. I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.